thank you all for coming out tonight to attend this event with Professor Lewis Nelson. My name is Joshua Stewart. I am the Assistant Director for UVA Clubs and Global Engagement. I am a fellow Arts and Sciences, class of 2018. I have the pleasure of working with the UVA Club of Palm Beaches, Greater Orlando, and Jacksonville, who have put together quite a great evening. If you got to attend last talk with Richard Guy Wilson, Lewis Nelson is going to give something just as great. So thank you for attending. I just want to go over the house rules for tonight. If you had time to watch the video that was posted on the registration page, that is great. This event will have a longer Q&A section, so please submit all questions you have in the chat box from now till the end. And Lewis is going to give a 5 to 8 minute brief presentation that is flying over the video if you did not have a chance to watch it. So please keep those questions coming in throughout the entire session. And now I'd like to turn over to Scott French, who is the Vice President of the UVA Club of Greater Orlando, who will introduce Lewis. Scott.
Great, thank you, Josh. Thank you, everybody, for turning out tonight. I'll just say that I'm also a parent, and my son is a rising second year studying computer science and history. But my job tonight is to welcome you all and to introduce Lewis Nelson. Lewis Nelson is a professor of architectural history and vice provost for academic outreach. He joined UVA faculty, architecture school faculty in 2001. He has a very long vita, but I think we're going to save some time tonight. I'm going to focus on the most recent work that's of great interest to me. He is the co-editor of Educated in Tyranny, Slavery at Thomas Jefferson's University, co-edited with Maureen McGinnis and with many fine contributions of other UVA faculty. The only other thing I want to say is if you haven't watched Lewis's presentation to the Board of Visitors, you absolutely should take time to watch it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you. Lewis.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Scott. Just a confirmation, can everybody hear me? Thumbs up? We're good? Okay, great. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Scott said I've been teaching at the University of Virginia since 2001. And I thought what I'd do is just give a very brief flyover of some of the things that I have been interested in before we jump into this most recent content, which has generated a great deal of interest across many different sectors of folks who know and love the University of Virginia. But I came to UVA as a historian, as an architectural historian, and I'm really deeply invested in understanding the relationship between the lived experience, meaning people's everyday lives, and architecture and landscapes. And so I really imagine myself as a historian of places that takes seriously buildings as evidence in the writing of those histories. So my work tends to have a really deep focus and a deep engagement with particular locations. Folks that have looked at the longer trajectory of my career have noticed that I ran 10 years of field schools in Jamaica. We were in the same community in Jamaica for 10 years, for 10 summers. For 6 weeks every summer, I would take about 20 students from UVA to go live in this one community. We got to know people, became sort of part of the fabric of that particular community, and we engaged in house repairs and some sort of social justice work around quality of housing, while simultaneously preservation work, architectural history, and oral history work. So my work is also really deeply engaged in the contexts of places and the communities that currently occupy those places. So I'm a little bit a sociologist, a little bit a sort of social justice activist, a lot architect, and a lot historian as well, all sort of mashed up into one, which sometimes means people don't really understand what it is that I am, and that's fine. But more recently, in the last few years, I have been thinking a lot about my home community right here in Charlottesville, and at the University of Virginia. And my work around the history of the early university really began before summer of 2017, but it definitely in the summer of 2017 took on a different tack, right, a different turn, because in some ways, in a lot of ways, things just got really personal. And so I have continued to, with our students, large numbers of students and lots of colleagues around the university, have been asking questions around the University of Virginia, and what kinds of questions can we ask about its history. And so we have recently released this book, which has really met with some acclaim, which is great, which I'm happy to talk about the book as well. But what I thought I would do is, for those of you that haven't had a chance to see the hour-long video that we did send out to YouTube, I think it's on YouTube. We sent that out by email. I thought I would we'll do a quick screen share, and I'll just walk over the highest level points, some of the kind of key takeaways from that content, because I'd like to spend most of our time in Q&A. I actually find these kinds of conversations, sometimes hard questions, but also just clarifying questions, are really helpful in these kinds of in these discussions. So I'm going to do share screen and drop down the little green tab, and it says, Josh, that I've been disabled for share screen. So is that an option to swap?
Try now.
There we go. Yep. Now we got it. Okay, are you all seeing the screen with UVA on it? Yes, okay, great. All right, so, teaching at the University of Virginia, when I first got the offer in 2001 to come teach at the University of Virginia, I still at times can't believe that I got extended the offer, because what it means is to teach early American architecture in the midst of a UNESCO World Heritage Site celebrated specifically because of its contributions to early American architecture, right? And so it is this amazing opportunity, an incredible privilege that I take very, very seriously. My opportunity to teach the history of architecture in this particular location. And, the Academical Village at UVA has given us these sort of amazing storylines. And one of those storylines, an incredibly important storyline, ties it to the person of Thomas Jefferson. One of the things that I do say in the video, but I remind my students of regularly, is that Thomas Jefferson dedicated the entirety of his life to building out the arc of the infrastructures of democracy. We know that he, of course, authors the Declaration of Independence. He is engaged with James Madison on the masterminding the Constitution. He's thinking about the three branches of government. He's thinking about checks and balances. One of those checks and balances that we don't often talk about is education, right? Thomas Jefferson would say that the best defense against a corrupt government is an educated populace. And so when you think about the University of Virginia in that larger arc, it's not at all a surprise that he dedicated, at the age of 74, right, the next 10 years of his life to building out an educational institution that would, in his mind and in our minds today, be a component of the architecture of democracy. And so I often talk with our students about how the University of Virginia is rightly understood in this larger, incredible arc of Jefferson's commitment to a lifetime building out that infrastructure and that architecture of democracy, and that education manifest in the University of Virginia really does that. That's absolutely true, and I don't discount that narrative at all. I think it's an incredibly important narrative that I would want all Americans to understand, and certainly all of our students at the University of Virginia and our alumni. But what that does, because that's such a compelling and a powerful story, that particular narrative has shadowed any other potential interpretation, right? It's so compelling, it's so worthy of celebration, it has meant that we have not told other really critical stories that are part of the, that are part of this scenario. So I turn with my students often to look at this particular print. This print is produced in the mid-1820s, right as the University of Virginia is coming to completion. This is a really early envisioning by Jefferson doesn't produce the image, but he's involved in conversations around the image. And it represents the University of Virginia through that lens of education, right? Because what is it foreground but those 10 pavilions, which were intended to be the residence for the 10 faculty who would be teaching the 10 domains of knowledge that were essential, always useful knowledge, of course, that were essential for a new democracy. So this particular envisioning, this representation of the academical village really foregrounds that framework of education. The lens here is an architecture of democracy for a new education. Incredibly important lens. But as we have been digging into the records of the University of Virginia, it's been important for us to recognize that this framework is so compelling that we actually have to teach ourselves how to unsee or to re-see, to see anew, the academical village in a different way. And so that's where this particular document has become really important and effective and powerful for us. This is a plat of the University of Virginia in 1856. So it's about 2.5 decades after the opening of the University of Virginia. And if, can you all see my cursor? Sorry, if my cursor's on the screen, can you see my cursor? You can, okay. That's a helpful teaching tool. So this is the lawn, right? Here we have the 10 pavilions, 5 on either side. There's the rotunda. This is a landscape that we know quite well. These are the gardens behind, and of course, these are the ranges with the hotels. So this is the academical village. But what's interesting here is when we look at the academical village through this lens, a different lens, we actually see that immediately adjacent to it, right, what would become McCormick Road, that area along McCormick Road, is subdivided into 10 grass lots. Each grass lot dedicated to one of the 10 professors. And then down here, there's gardens, 10 gardens, 1 garden and 1 grass lot dedicated to each pavilion, which raises questions for us. And I think I've got a detail of it here. It's a little easier to see. But looking at this plat raises questions for us. Well, why would a professor need a grass lot? Why would a professor need a garden? Well, of course, because professors have livestock, right? They have dairy cows, they are stabling horses, they're growing vegetables. There's a whole landscape of productivity that is also part and parcel of the University of Virginia, that when we use the education framework, we're carving that productivity out of the story. And so this particular plat, a different way of seeing the academical village, raises for us a different question about, oh, there's a whole nother landscape of operation at UVA that we haven't really considered. And that is, people are eating 3 meals a day. Where are they getting that food? How's that food getting processed? Where do they go to the bathroom, right? And so all the necessaries of everyday life come into view, and that particular framework, forces us to ask different questions about, well, who's in that landscape? Who's doing all that work? Who's tending the gardens? Who's milking the cows? And so that scenario has led us to ask very, very different kinds of questions of the academical village. This is Pavilion 4. When we look at Pavilion 4, the standard, our standard interpretation has been that this, of course, and rightly, was the residence of a professor. We know that the professors occupy the apartments upstairs, right? So the upper story is the apartment for the professor. The downstairs, the ground level, is the classroom space. And so we've long talked about the pavilions as having these two sort of critical functions: classroom spaces downstairs, professors' apartments for their families upstairs. And that's absolutely true. But as we started looking into other records, we actually were able to uncover the 1830 census, and then the 1840 census, the 50 census, and the 60 census. When we start pulling up these 19th century censuses, the decennial census, we pulled up this particular, the occupant of this pavilion is George Bladerman. And George Bladerman is a Berlin-born modern languages professor. He's the first modern languages professor at UVA. He's the first occupant of the building. We pulled him up in the Albemarle County census records. There he is. We look across and we can see that there's, there's an older white man, there's an older white woman. That's George and his wife. There's 3 young sons, 3 sons, 15 and below. That's great. But we can actually turn the page on that census, and on the back half of that census, you can actually see wait a second, George Bladerman is also the owner of 18 enslaved people. So when we tell the story of this particular pavilion, and we actually look at the historical record, we can't just tell the story of just Bladerman and his wife and 3 sons. We actually have to tell the story of an enslaved population, which then raise questions for us. Well, how pervasive is that enslaved population? This is that same 1830 census distributed graphically. And you'll see that right here is George Bladerman's pavilion, Pavilion 4, residents of a family of 5, and an enslaved African-American population of 18 resident in that particular building. And so what we've done is we've started to distribute. And as we started looking and kind of peeling under the layers, looking at the archival record, turns out that there's actually a substantial population of enslaved people at the University of Virginia through its operation. And of course there is, right? There's about 150 enslaved people in residence at UVA at any one point in time for its full half century of operation. Where are all those people, right? Where are they living? How are they housed? Really, really important questions. We have some answers to those questions, but not a lot of them. One of those answers is that we've often talked about the pavilions as 2 stories. But when you, as you can see in this digital reconstruction, they're not. They're 3-story buildings. There's a whole subterranean floor. So if we look at the pavilion from this side, right, we get this view. This is a 2-story pavilion. But when we look at it from the work yard, from the back side, it's pretty clear that they're actually 3-story buildings. And so that whole 3rd floor, intentionally made invisible from this particular view, opens out into a contained space of enslavement. So there's a whole landscape of slavery here that has actually been masked or hidden away, bounded back behind the landscape of education. When we start digging into those critical questions and sort of understanding these pavilions as 3-story buildings, we start to get some names. This is one of the very few people for whom we have not just a name, but also a photograph. This is Lucy Cottrell. Lucy Cottrell here is holding a Bladerman granddaughter. So one of those 3 sons that shows up in the 1830 census, they get married, and their very first granddaughter is Charlotte, who's being held in this photograph. Lucy Cottrell is with the Bladerman family for a very long period of time. Lucy Cottrell is one of those 18 people registered in the 1830 census. And so the opportunity to have both a photograph and the census record and the spaces which she occupied, right? We know that this was probably Lucy Cottrell's bedchamber. We know that that's definitely Lucy Cottrell's kitchen. There's a whole landscape of her operation. She also is raising 2 sons in the midst of her own enslavement. And very, very interesting questions here about what does it mean to be a mother and a cook. She's in control of a pretty substantial population of other people who are all trying to bring essential resources together for the delivery of 3 meals a day to the white family. There's a whole really interesting landscape of operation that's part of that. So as an architectural historian, I've been taking the documentary records that show up in these archives. I've been taking what we know about the broader historical record, and I've been taking students into the crawl spaces, right? So this is the attic of Pavilion 1 from a couple years ago now. But we've been looking really, really closely at these buildings to better understand where are all these enslaved people being housed? How do they move? Do they have separate staircases? What do they see out of different windows, right? Who gets to see what and where? And so this has helped us to repopulate a lot of these spaces. This field work, which students have been doing, have been helping us to repopulate all of these spaces to better understand how they look, right? We've been engaged in archaeology in a lot of the cellars. This is the cellar for, the kitchen cellar for Hotel A, which was one of the largest enslaved populations for one of these hotels. And we've also been using digital visualization. Those of you that have seen the lecture will know that I spent quite a bit of time unpacking this particular digital model, because this model allows us to remove all the stuff from the later 19th and the 20th centuries to better understand what did the Academical Village actually look like as Jefferson imagined it and in the first couple of years after its operation. We know that rear yards are filled with all kinds of buildings. There's a whole interesting series of kitchens and smokehouses, places where hogs are being butchered, chicken coops, all kinds of really interesting things. So all that work using digital models, archival record, historical accounts, we published in this volume, knowing, of course, that the University of Virginia had also taken the lead on the national stage by committing to install, we're the first major university to do this, to install a substantial memorial to the enslaved population that was essential to the operation of the university for its first half century. So this is an architect's model design of the memorial, which is now open. Some of you might have seen some of the early use of that memorial already. The memorial is an incredibly well-considered contemplative design. It includes the names of all the individuals that we were able to uncover thus far in our research. It allows us to incorporate additional names as the design unfolds over time. And it really is just a beautiful commitment to truth-telling. And in so many ways, UVA is at the front edge of that work. And I am incredibly proud to be both a scholar of slavery, to be unpacking that at my own institution, but also to know that the institution has the commitment to continue to press forward towards that truth-telling. Because if in fact UVA wants to be and wants to continue to be an institution committed to a sustainable democracy, as I say in the lecture, we can only do that by telling the truth about our own past. So I'm going to end there. And there's another view of the inside of the memorial. I will end there and stop share and be delighted to pivot to some questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Louis. We'll start with the first question from Gary. A number of the first and earliest professors came from overseas.
Correct.
Does the data show that they embraced slave labor themselves?
Such a great question. So a substantial percentage of the, actually in the very first era, almost all of the professors are European born and are coming from a context in which, of course, slavery is outlawed in Europe at this period. And so they're coming from a non-slave affirming context to a slave affirming context. And huge numbers of those professors really do end up grappling with major problems. Some percentage of them leave the University of Virginia because they come with anti-slavery perspectives, and it's just simply not possible to navigate the social context of 19th century Virginia with a rabid anti-slavery position. But frankly, the majority of the professors fold, and whether they have a public stance on slavery or not, they end up purchasing, as Professor Bladerman does, they end up buying into the institution of slavery and become slave owners themselves. It's a great question.
Thank you. The next question is from Ms. Adrienne Burke. Are there plans to do any public interpretation about these hidden spaces on the lawn to try and communicate the stories of faculty, students, as visitors?
That's great. So the answer is yes. How do I say this? There are a couple processes in play. This is happening in real time, right? You're asking this question as we're grappling with that very question on the line. I can tell you that a few of the Pavilion residents have already made internal installations, so installations in their living spaces, which they have control over as residents, so that when they have guests over, there are interpretive panels that they can use with basically in the middle of parties or if they're having students over. And so we've helped to produce some of that content for professors, both in their upstairs spaces and also in the cellar spaces. There is an active conversation right now about the installation of interpretive signage and memorial markers around the Academical Village. And there is also some conversation about the possibility of reinterpreting some dimension of one of the garden spaces. That we have to keep in mind that the garden spaces are actually have been cared for years by the ladies of the Garden Club of Virginia. So the gardens as we experience them today are all a product of the 1940s, right? They were all installed in the 1940s well, I shouldn't say to override, but installed in the 1940s because those spaces had largely been abandoned. The rise of the modern kitchen and refrigeration meant that those service spaces were no longer necessary. Those service spaces were abandoned. And then in the 1940s, the ladies of the Garden Club of Virginia came in and gave us the gardens that we experience today in their imagination of what a colonial garden would look like. So they've been there for more than 50 years. So those gardens are now part of the historic landscape. They're part of a 20th century recollection of what that landscape would look like. So we want to tread really carefully as we're interpreting that to make sure that we're not just sweeping away a 20th century layer to try to recreate an early 19th century layer. So there's tricky questions there, but if the highest level question is the university committed to trying to interpret this in the space of the academical village? The answer is yes.
Great. I have a question. The number of slaves per pavilion were quite disparate. Do you have any information on why a professor/household would have 2 and why another would have 20?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And the answer lies in the vagaries of property ownership and hiring. So the enslaved people that might be serving a family are not always necessarily owned by that white family. There is a process of hiring out that's very common in the 19th century, where you might own X number of people, and then you'll supplement your workforce with additional people that you'll hire, often on an annual basis, but they're actually still technically owned by someone else. And it's also true that some of these professors have off-grounds parcels. And so they may also be raising agricultural fields, right? They may be working agricultural fields as an extension of their tuition, as an extension of their salary, as a way of supplementing their income from the university, which was quite paltry in the 19th century.
Great. Question was from Lee Postman. Thank you, Lee. Next question is from Alan Vollmer, I believe. Having spent 6 years at the university in the late 60s and early 70s, can't believe I haven't heard a single word about the slave population. Was this story widely known back then and just suppressed, or is much of this knowledge newly rediscovered?
Thank you from an alumnus from a long ago having the courage to ask that question. I'm really grateful to you, wherever you are. Yeah, so it's important. There you are, Alan, thank you. Yeah, so I tread very carefully here, right? Because institutions tell stories about themselves in all different kinds of ways, right? And there's all kinds of motivations that are at play there. So I'm not wanting to throw anybody under the bus in any kind of answer to this question. I think it is generous to say that the institution was grappling with lots of its own issues in the 1960s, and then again in the late 1980s and 90s, and then now in our present. There's sort of really critical moments of transformation in which the institution was grappling with these things. A commitment to even teaching slavery in the classroom just as a historical fact, not even at UVA, was what was at contest in the 60s, right? And so the 1960s, there's this moment of what's referred to as the new history. Whether UVA was going to teach the new history was the conversation of the day. In the 1980s, well, so Scott French is here, right? And there's a whole wave of folks who were raising really, really important questions in the 80s and the 90s that I was not a part of. Obviously, it's well before my time, around the early history of the university. So it's not fair to say that it was unknown, but the complexity and the layers of the data that we have, much of it actually made available to us by massive databases, right? The fact that we have advanced technologies, visualization, as well as data analytics, that's changed the conversation. And that's allowed us to tell a more nuanced and a more complicated history in the last 5 years. So in part, it's the arc of the way we've told history just at institutions generally, and part also it's the emergence of just new technologies that allow us the depth and complexity that wasn't possible in the 90s.
Fantastic. Okay, I gotta ask to skip a question. Okay, here we go. When did the presence of slavery finally end at the university? From Don's iPad.
Hey, Don's iPad. Wow, that's it. I could take the easy answer there, or I could take the loaded answer. We're going to go with the easy one here, and that is, so technically emancipation, of course, Emancipation Proclamation is 1863. By 1865, slavery as an institution is formally terminated. There are many people, however, who are at UVA. Henry Martin is the famous example of this, who are enslaved at the university, who remain in and around the spaces of the university after the Civil War. There are all kinds of really interesting and complicated ways to try to unpack that. One telling has that the social relationships are so incredibly important that these now newly emancipated African Americans are not willing to break bonds with the people that they know the best. Another telling, and I think one that's probably a little bit more closely aligned with historical thinking in the moment, is many of those recently emancipated African Americans had nowhere else to go, right? They didn't have the capital and the agency to be able to leave. And so slavery as an institution, of course, ends at the end of the Civil War. But as a sort of experience, there are many people who are formerly enslaved who remain on at the university for a generation or more.
Great. This question is from Alicia Chow. Has there ever been any conversation about the lives of enslaved people at UVA being a part of new student orientation for each and every first-year student?
Whew. Yes. Y'all are not pitching softballs here. Yes, there has been a conversation. The university has not moved in that direction yet.
Perfect. Next question. What is the latest evidence of an enslaved or previously enslaved person still working at the university?
I mean, how late in time?
Yes, I believe so.
I'm gonna guess probably into the late 1890s would be my guess. Although so Scott, you may actually know the answer to this better than I do. Henry Martin is sort of the notorious. He's a sort of famous example here. I know he's photographed actually, maybe 1910 even. Do you remember? Am I right on that, Scott? Do you remember? Oh, he needs to be unmuted. You can put it in the chat.
You can unmute yourself.
Right. I was just looking for the date of his death.
Yeah.
So, but he would be one of the latest, I would think, and I think in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And others who had been enslaved in the Academical village, Berkeley Bullock was an enslaved laborer who lived with Professor Socrates Maupin in Pavilion 8, and he died in 1908. He was not working for the university, but he was working near the university and associated very closely with the university up until his death. And so I would say probably early 20th century.
Scott, has your piece on Berkeley Bullock come out yet?
Yeah, I just put a link in to Josh to say if anyone wants to read a really fascinating story of one of those many individuals who have been documented, read about Berkeley Bullock. And
let me actually just make a pitch there for the whole series.
Yeah.
About 8 months ago, UVA Today made a commitment to start doing some of this truth-telling, and you can find a series. If you go to UVA Today and search for it, it's UVA and the History of Race. And I think we've already published 6 or 7 of them, and there's another 6 to 8 lined up ready to come in the fall, maybe even late summer. And these are all expert written. They're much longer than the normal UVA Today piece. They really read a little bit more like a scholarly essay.
They're footnoted.
Yeah, with footnotes.
Yeah.
It's a pretty important commitment by the university to engage in that truth-telling on lots of fronts, and not just the history of slavery, but well into the 19th and the 20th century.
Fantastic. We're going to Tim's question. Did any students bring slaves to the university? And if so, how were they accommodated?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the official line from the university in the early 19th century is no. right? The code of conduct by the university forbids students from bringing their own enslaved people, so that those services, all the services that would be provided by a manservant, a personal servant, are being provided by the enslaved population associated with the hotel keepers. So the official line is no. But what also becomes really quite clear is that students do, in fact, bring their own enslaved people, and they board them in town. We've got growing evidence of these manservants that are serving the wealthiest of the students, but because they're forbidden from being housed in and around the Academical Village, they're being housed in town.
Great. We have a question from Karen Greb. Can you give us more insight into Jefferson's struggle with owning slaves? He was keeping this aspect of his home in UVA hidden, so it must have weighed on him, no?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any question. This, of course, much ink has been spilled on this particular topic, so far be it from me to summarize, but I will. What is Jefferson's relationship to slavery is an incredibly complicated question. There's, as I often tell my students, when you're reading Jefferson, you always have to read to whom he's writing, because he's very aware of his audience. And so you can very easily find directly contradictory positions in Jefferson's writing, or mutually contradictory positions in Jefferson's writing. And the answer to that is he's navigating an incredibly heated political topic as a public leader, as a public intellectual, in a very, very fraught political landscape. And so he says one thing to one person in a private letter, and then publicly he'll say something different. But historians do generally agree that Jefferson recognized the hypocrisy, right? Democracy and slavery are mutually inexcusable. Jefferson sees that. He's no dummy, right? He's a genius. So he sees the hypocrisy. He does try to mask the hypocrisy as much as possible. And he also becomes increasingly despairing around slavery over the course of his lifetime. Whereas earlier in his life, his writings are more hopeful that the American South specifically and the nation might be able to come up with some solution for, quote unquote, the slave problem. And in his mind, that generally means exportation back to Africa, but it at least is a solution, a response. But by the end of his life, he has moved much more into a position of despair. And one can look at his late writings in the 20s almost as a predictor of the Civil War. He sees that this is going to be a fundamental problem that will have the potential to destroy an America that he spent so much time building.
Emily has a question. Are there plans for reinterpreting other spaces around grounds, like the African American burial site near the cemetery or Catherine Foster Park by Now Hall?
So we haven't had much conversation about reinterpreting Catherine Foster site, more popularly known as Kitty Foster. In part just because we actually have signage there, right? Sort of feel like let's just at least get some critical signage out to locations, and Kitty Foster's site has been interpreted. The African American burial ground also has some signage, but really could actually use more. And just this week, actually, I've been in conversation with some folks who oversee other dimensions of that cemetery to tell a more complete story there, first in pamphlets, but then also in signage. So there is conversation about doing the slow, careful, hard work of reinterpreting and reinscribing the Academical Village with some truth-telling, or not just the Academical Village, actually the whole of university's grounds, around truth-telling around our history of race and racism. So you can expect to see that coming out slowly over the course of the next 6 months to a year.
A question from Leslie. Is there information about interracial relationships between faculty and slaves during these early years on the line, or those living on the line?
Yes. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. One, it's very clear that there are incidents of rape, and it is rape, by white men on Black women. One of the dynamics that we have to keep in mind here is that The enslaved population during construction is majority men. The enslaved population during operation, which is the majority of the time, has a majority of enslaved women. It's not, the balance shifts a little bit. There are certainly plenty of enslaved men around, but there's a substantial percentage of enslaved women. Those enslaved women have been given tasks by the people that own them, which are usually the professors or the hotel keepers. So they have a full day, and they spend most of their day avoiding students, because the students are predominantly coming from plantation landscapes. Most of them are going to inherit a plantation. They're practicing masters. And so the reality here is that we have privileged white men, very young white men, who are figuring out what does it mean to be a master in a landscape in which, for the majority of them, none of the enslaved people are actually owned by them, but they dispense demands on those enslaved women frequently. And so it puts the enslaved women in particular in very, very difficult positions because they already have a full day and they've just received a task. If they say no to that task or decline that opportunity to serve the student in a certain way, students are practicing working out the violence that is the institution of slavery. So the answer is yes. We have very clear evidence, historical evidence of rape that is happening to enslaved women by students at UVA. Only the incidents that show up in the records are the most egregious. A three-way rape of a 12-year-old girl, for example. The everyday rape that is part of the American South doesn't show up in the records because it's normative. And this becomes really sobering. Harvard University released a DNA study about 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, that made clear that because of these 23andMe and the sort of large numbers of DNA studies that are now out, and the sort of what's the phrase when you make popular? The popularization is the word I'm going to use. Anyway, there's another phrase. Lots of people are now having their DNA tested, which now generates large volumes of data. And when you actually look at the data for Black men in America, there are certain signatures in the Y chromosome, which is the consistent masculine chromosome, right? That's the male determining chromosome. 1/4 of African-American men have a European-derived Y chromosome, which means that somewhere up the line, there is a white man grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. And in most of those contexts, that's not going to be consensual sex. So this is just a really, really hard part of the story that is so painful that the American South has not had the courage to tell it, but the archival record and now the scientific DNA record makes pretty clear that it was pretty commonplace.
Thank you for answering that difficult question. Amy has a question about something that's more light. What methods are being used to find out more names of the slaves of the memorial, and how confident are you about finding more?
Yeah, I think we have identified 95% of the names that we're going to find, right? We've designed the memorial so that, well, with one exception, there'll be one stream I'll point to in a second. We've designed the memorial so we can add names post-construction, right? We anticipate the possibility of finding additional names. As we're able to do that, we want to add those names to the memorial itself. Absolutely, very, very important. The archival record might surface more, but we've done a lot of digging, right? We're not going to find too many other archival or manuscript sets that will point to additional names. We might find some, but we won't be many. The more interesting and potentially more productive route is that we've also, over the last 8 months, seen the emergence of a Descendants community leadership group. And that is individuals who live in Charlottesville and individuals who live beyond Charlottesville who identify as the descendants of the enslaved community, starting to bring their family histories together, sharing within those families some of those networks. And Ancestry.com has a very useful tool which allows individual families to put family trees to see how connected they are one to the next. And so some genealogist leaders within almost all Black women within that community are beginning to draw together and more closely the family trees of the individuals who in the community identify as the descendants of the formerly enslaved population. And so that process through family histories and through oral histories might also begin to generate additional names of people that whose names just did not surface and did not survive, who were erased essentially from the archival record.
Thank you. We have a question from Jocelyn. What else can you tell us about the lives of the slaves in addition to Lucy Cottrell's?
I tell the story of Lucy because her the documents of her sale are very clear. We know quite a bit about her family. We know a bit about her ailing mother. We know where she lived. We have a photograph of her. And she shows up unnamed in many of the census records. She's a remarkable exception. The vast majority of the enslaved population, we have not even close to that amount of data. So we've seized on a couple families. The Gibbons family is an incredibly important family. We're able to tell a lot. We know a lot about their story. The Cottrells are an incredibly important family. We also know quite a bit about some of the men who are involved in construction. The construction records at the university are really rich. And so we're able to tell the story of someone like Sam the carpenter, who is there for the full 10 years of construction. We know where he's working. We know his skill sets. We know that he's actually functioning as an enslaved man and an overseer of other enslaved men simultaneously. And we also know that he is overseeing his own son as one of those enslaved people in the population. So we have these little windows, but the honest answer to your question is we know so, except for the sort of normative stories. Historians tell us this is the typical experience of this person. This would be the typical experience of a carpenter. This is the typical experience of a cook. But beyond that, those windows are few and far between. But we're doing our very best to ground as much of that storytelling in as rigorous and as accurate a history as possible.
Thank you. We have a question from Nick Duke Sr. Might you tell us about the memorial to enslaved laborers that was scheduled to be dedicated in April?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. That's great. So the memorial to enslaved laborers is part of a incredibly impressive process. The University of Virginia made the decision to build a memorial without a known budget, without a scope of work, or without any commitment to what the aesthetics would look like. Like, that's a massive risk. But the University of Virginia did that because it was so important for the designers to spend time with the descendant community that I was just talking about, right? It's critical that the descendant community decide what the critical dimensions of the aesthetics, what work does this memorial need to do? It shouldn't be the university that was making that decision. It's the descendants of the offended or the of that enslaved population. And so we had to pivot really quickly to do some trust building. As you can well imagine, the descendants of the enslaved population are, not, the university doesn't hold a lot of trust with that community. So we had to do a lot of trust building and brought the designers into that process. And the designers did an incredible job in parish houses and in kitchens and in parlors of the African-American population here in Charlottesville, listening and talking. And then stepped away for 3 months, took all of those notes, all of that data, and came forward with this design. The design is incredible, and it reflects so many of those core commitments. The descendant community said it must be embedded in the soil. Like, The blood and the tears of our ancestors are in the soil. So it had to be earthy, it had to be low, it had to be connected with the soil. It also had to be monumental, right? And so that's a challenge. How do you make something that's low also monumental? So the designers picked, it's the same diameter as the rotunda. It's big, right? It's a massive installation. So it's monumental, it's huge, it's overwhelming, while simultaneously being set within the soil, right? It's deep and down. It had to have the names. The descendant community felt very strongly. As the Vietnam Memorial has names, so too, we want this to have names. So it had to have names, and so the names are there. It also had to function as a mode of education. And so inscribed on the inside is a timeline, starting from 1619 all the way through the death of Isabella Gibbons, who is a figure whose story shows up in that timeline. We rooted it in her story, but it's a more broad, comprehensive telling of the experience, the African-American experience in Virginia from the 17th century to the end of the 19th century. So it has a timeline. It's intended for school children, right? It has, it will have a website that has downloadable tools for teachers. We're an educational institution. It has to be educational. That was central to our work. So I could talk for hours. I'm so proud of that memorial. It's an incredibly important step. It's a symbolic step. It's a first step, but it's an incredibly important step.
And then for the last question, are there any former or current UVA students that are direct descendants of slaves that lived in the Academical village? I figured this would be fitting.
Yes. Yes, there are. I've been involved in a research project called Jewel, Jefferson's University of the Early Life. A substantial number of the descendants of that community have been students that have been involved in unpacking the history of their ancestors together with the university. A number of them have been lawn residents. It's an incredibly moving and powerful thing. And often they don't want their story told, right? You don't see that showing up in UVA today because it's so hard, it's sensitive, it's very personal. There's a lot of emotion for a Black student that goes through all of that. And so that's just not something that they want the university to capitalize on. And I totally understand that. So the answer is yes, it is beautiful. It is also painful.
Yeah.
Oh, that was the last question.
That was the last question.
Keep them coming.
You want me to keep them coming? I'll keep them coming. I have people just started writing in. I got to.
So I will say this. My email is lnelson@virginia.edu. I am very happy for you to send in emails. I do my very best to try to respond to emails in 48 to 72 hours. You won't get an email response in an hour. But if you do have following questions, I really am happy to point you to resources, connect you to other folks that are more expert in lots of this content. I should say I'm a spokesperson here, but there's 20 scholarly voices behind what I'm saying, right? This is certainly not all my work. Happy to make connections, happy to answer simple questions. And just so grateful that our alumni community and our friends are interested and willing to engage in this hard conversation. I've had the same reception time and time again as I've given this kind of talk. It just makes me so proud to be a member of this community. Thank you all so much for your willingness to have the courage, really, to be clear-eyed and walk with the university in this hard work. Thanks.
Yes, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Louis, for, I can't really call a presentation, but just information and dialogue and discussion about, again, like you said, a hard topic to have. And for all those who did ask questions that we didn't get to, I will try to pass those along to Louis. Allow a couple of days, maybe more than that, as we're all busy. But we'll try to get to your questions as soon as possible. So yeah, Thank you all for coming. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great night.
Okay. Cheerio, everyone. Thank you.